Okay, so this is the second Data Together reading group, and we're just going to start with a round of intros. So maybe quickly, if you could say your name or like preferred screen name, and where you are based, that would be great. And we'll just sort of keep it a little bit shorter today because I am at a loss for ideas. So the people I see in order are Kevin, Brendan, then Rob.
Hey everyone, I'm Kevin at Light and Luck on Slack and everywhere. I'm in San Diego, California, and I help out with the web monitoring stuff.
I'm Brendan, B5 on the internet. I'm currently in Brooklyn.
I'm Rob, strangely named Mr. Ogrog or MR0GROG, or however you might read it for yourself on the internet. And I live in San Francisco, and I poke around on some of the software for the web monitoring stuff.
And so then I see Michelle, Mackie, and GCA Hill next.
Hi everyone, I'm Michelle Browse. I work at Protocol Labs, doing some work on the sort of edgy data together use case for IPFS. Currently in New Jersey, but usually based out of San Francisco, sometimes New York City.
Oh,
Let's wait. Oh, go Rob.
I was just going to say, I should note, I'm always mixing up context. Also, I'm doing some work related to documentation and kind of user case studies and approaches for IPFS, which is also a context that matters here. So I shouldn't pretend that I'm not also involved on that side of things.
So why don't we skip Mackie while he does some audio troubleshooting, and I can't tell if you can tell that I'm saying things about him right now. And then we'll do, I see JCA Hill, then Mash Zone Song. I'm not sure I'm not able to hear you. I'm not sure if you're speaking or trying to use your mic, JCA Hill, but I'm unfortunately not hearing you. Is everyone else? Were other people able to? Okay. No worries. Why don't we move over, and then if you're able to jump in with an intro, please do it, or feel free to make it in the chat. And that part got cut off. So maybe Nash next.
Hi, I'm a graphic designer based in Philadelphia, and I'm interested in researching internet culture from an art historical perspective, which kind of necessarily involves a lot of intersections with archiving and preserving data. So that's my interesting here.
Hello, can you hear me? I am based in New Zealand. I am at the University of Canterbury, and I study philosophy, and I'm interested in the philosophy and the philosophical implications of memes.
Awesome, thank you for joining us. So I'll do myself quickly. I'm Dawn. I'm DC Walk Online. I am currently in a public space, so there's noise. Apologies, but also in Manhattan, but I'm usually in Toronto.
Hi, I'm Matt. I'm also in Toronto, but also actually in Toronto, and I'm from Edgy. I've been involved with the archiving group since December of 2016, and I love everybody here.
Go Brendan, but I was also just
Matt,
I think it's on to you now.
That was going to be my question.
Okay, go ahead, Brendan. Well, I didn't realize I was facilitating, but I'm happy to do it. And I didn't read the extras that are in the PR. I stopped 18 minutes ago to get an emergency slice of pizza to fuel my ride home. And I saw the PR and I tried to look at it, but it was hard. So I have not thought about that question. Instead, I haven't really thought about this 9/10 question, although I am interested in the way that Wikipedia talks about it. I don't know. I don't actually have I'm sorry, I've just arrived. I don't have the notes up. Here they are. I put some stuff in the Hackpad. I could go through my own thoughts, or I'd prefer if we could kind of collect a set of questions that it seems like we ought to be dealing with. So maybe people want to raise their hands and give some thoughts. Sorry, my computer's also acting up. Who's got their hand up? Just go. Who's got their hand up?
I can
go ahead, Don.
I really enjoy the different ways the readings kind of converged around ownership. And I think this kind of touches on something that's come up with the Data Together folks quite a bit, is like how or what comes out of using like a language around specifically possession and then also like a language of ownership. And I thought that, yeah, now we have some ways to maybe address that. So I hope that we can maybe have that be one question, and it seems to me that cuts across a few readings.
Anyone else? I mean, go ahead, Brendan.
Yeah, I think I need to fully cop to not having read everything, but I feel like I'm back in college. This is great. I'm sorry, Professor, I didn't do the reading. But the one of the readings that I did manage to get through, I found there's this like constant concern that almost all topics are being introduced as a sort of like pairing with another sort of like adjacent topic that was necessary to sort of either contextualize or cleave the notion of ownership away from, right? And particularly with the reading that was highlighted in the Slack, where we sort of are using the context of capitalism or a context of an economy to sort of dissociate to deal with the notion of ownership. I thought it was really interesting, and I just wanted to sort of flag and maybe catalog the topics that ownership sort of seems to come up against. So I guess to phrase that as a question, it's like, what topics do we continually reference the notion of ownership in context to? Also, Mash has a question.
I just wanted to say that for me, I think the Wikipedia article about the 9/10 of laws, that one I think was the most interesting to me. Although like the article itself was kind of sparse, but there's so many like intersections that could to tie into that topic of how like the existing ownership sets up for future ownership, and also the kind of legal precedent that influences later decisions. So that one was really interesting to me.
Go ahead.
So in contrast to what you were saying earlier on Slack, Matt, I actually found the piece on the study on users in Goodreads to be extremely interesting. And it set me off thinking on a whole bunch of different courses. I'm not sure how many of them are particularly applicable to the topic of ownership. But one thing that I did think of as really interesting that I started thinking about is because I was on Goodreads a little bit before that, but I had switched over to another service called Readernaut, and I was mostly using that at the time that Goodreads went out. But Readernaut also had like a similar set of problems that can be generalized to this idea of like a overlap, but also mostly disconnect between the goals and imperatives of the owner of a platform and the users of a platform. But it was a very different disconnect from the one that we are always talking about, the one that we're talking about in the context of Goodreads, which is the owner imperative to like monetize or capitalize, versus Readernaut fell apart or was problematic in the end because it ultimately wound up being like the one indie. It was cool because it was indie, but it turned into the one indie owners like platform for experimenting and learning Django and things, and stuff would change willy-nilly without a lot of respect for like the users of the platform, and it became problematic for a very different set of reasons, but that's still generalizable in the same way. And so I thought that was really interesting to think about, like what are other ways in which these disconnects are problematic that aren't just the traditional like capitalistic problem that we're always talking about.
Rob. That's already a lot. Does anybody else want to put something on the list? In a way, it seems to me Mash's comment is the one that is most obviously oriented around a particular reading.
Frozen mad face.
I can maybe jump in and say where I think Matt was going, which is we could start around that reading maybe in Mash's question. I mean, the other one I would say that kind of offers a way to a couple is Rob's thoughts, and then actually maybe connecting that one article into the selections that we read from the platform cooperativism book, because I see that one having a thread to the counter disintermediation. Did I say that right? Article, and then maybe we could like work back to sort of the other two, which were really a framing sort of set of chapters. And so, yeah, I mean, maybe Mash, if you'd like to expand a little bit on why you thought that article offered a lot, even if perhaps it was scant, and I know you dropped you dropped another reference in here, and I can try and speak to those bonus ones that maybe I'm the only one who read, so sorry. And maybe what we could do is identify what we need to know, because I think a lot of us still, like, I think we're kind of uncovering it now.
Well, I think that the 9/10 article is kind of relevant to the counter anti-disintermediation stuff as well, because a lot of the, well, basically all the stuff that's from that book, including the Trevor Show article, and because a lot of I guess their view on the history of the web is that it was like this kind of anarchic place that eventually was whoever took the data, whoever took control of the platforms by like locking in the users and things like that, ended up having the control. And so I guess it's kind of like showing how, I guess that was one of the things that I thought was related between those two.
Maybe do we want to, yeah, thank you for that intro, and go Brendan, and maybe I put this to all of us, like, I still feel like there's a few ways of reading possession is 9/10 of the law? Like, I think you suggest almost like a tactical one, or there's like a way that is used to adjudicate, and there's like a legal principle. So if other people have thoughts around like kind of just like that part, maybe we can talk about that a bit, but then go Brendan.
Actually, yeah, to me that felt like a really interesting like framing. And Mash, I feel like you sort of, I don't know if this is where you're heading with it, but for me, it sort of felt like there are a couple of, it's this question of framing, like this notion that the internet was some wild place that was colonized. I personally had a little trouble getting there, but instead of framing that in the negative, I think there's a question of like, of what, I think framing is really important in the conversation of possession and ownership. I think this question of possession is 9/10, building on what you were saying, Don, about this idea of that being a sort of legal framing, and that sort of invokes a sort of, it's enough to sort of get us into one place. But I think the thing that I was sort of wanting to point to connect some of these dots is like this notion of, are there other framings that maybe are worth, that are underexplored in the language of ownership and possession, and to what degree do they not map very well in digital spaces? Like this notion of, I don't feel like the internet was a place that was colonized, because it's an artificial construct of people. Like there were servers that someone started up, but you, at the same time, I find I can't not sympathize with the notion that platforms did show up to create enclosures. And so, I don't know, maybe those enclosures are the beginnings of ownership, but I don't know. I need to precise my language before I open my mouth.
Yeah, me and Jeremy had like a brief discussion about this yesterday, so I think he has some thoughts about the idea of like whether or not it was colonized or what happened, especially about like the early internet. His mic is working now.
I think it is. Is it working?
Yeah, we can hear you.
There we go. Wonderful.
Jump in.
Different machine. So I do find that there's a weird kind of this linear history thing that happens with media theorists and critical theorists when they're writing about the internet, where they describe in very linear terms, we had an opinion and then we think this now. And they often say this in a way where we were more naive, and then the world was lost. and this often takes the form of, we were cyber libertarians, everything was great in the early 90s, when this was just not a thing that was factually true about most of the world, when most of the world was not plugged into the internet. And they say like, weren't mailing lists great? Well, but they shut out people who weren't the type of people who knew how to get into mailing lists, and so they did all kinds of things that weren't great, and they were closed off to people who had .edu emails and all that sort of stuff. And there's this shift from we thought a thing, we as sort of, I don't know, permanent academic caste, we thought a thing, now we think a thing, and what do we do about how we think about a thing, when that may not be really what in aggregate, in statistical aggregate, is going to make most people's lives better. As an example of that, I was thinking about the fact that Creative Commons, you used to be able to license Creative Commons imagery on Facebook way back. And that eventually went away because Facebook just kept making their terms of service more onerous till eventually that it was no longer possible to do. And so even if you knew as a user that you had this sense of I can retain more control of my own stuff over if I pick some sort of license, like I don't really know how it works, but I know that I don't want to give it to Zuckerberg. Even if you knew that at the time, eventually that was just platformized out of your hands. So in discussing possession, I think you also have to discuss possession of information asymmetry, where if you don't value, if you sort of balk at the idea of of trying to defend your own stuff because you think that that's too formal, or you think, well, I'm just making my stuff, I want my stuff. People who don't balk at that will come and take it from you. And they will be very happy to just aggregate all your stuff and wait for your original content and original ideas and unlicensed works to fall by the wayside, and they will say, oh, well, we have it now, we possess it, 9/10 of the law, and that's it's a war of attrition, and people who play the long game, they know that, and they're willing to play that game. And a lot of people who are less sophisticated, they don't see that, or if they do see that, they think, well, it's too pie in the sky for me. So sort of went all over the place there.
But they were all good places.
I think Rob is up, and then me.
I forgot half of what I wanted to say, but I wanted to say I agree a lot with both Brendan and Jeremy about that sense of like this theoretical history of like the trajectory of the internet. And also I thought it was a really interesting point about how some of that relates to like an actually fairly closed group of more like-minded people in the early time of the internet when like we were better. Which somewhere I was reading recently, somebody had pointed out like, oh, you don't like the way a lot of people use Twitter or whatever now, back when like Twitter was better in its first few years, but also consider that like it's a lot more diverse place now and there are more people able to use it the way they want to use it. And that matters. And that's a very different way of approaching that set of questions. And so I just want to like connect those ideas because that jumped out at me as really interesting and very similar. And I forgot the other thing I wanted to say now, so I will abdicate.
And I do think what Rob just said there is very interesting, and it speaks to this more general problem of trying to craft any kind of community with, any open community ends up shifting away somehow from what it was before. Or that's almost always true, because openness means that you're actually open to changing something. Sometimes maybe what you really need is a closed community, because what you want is a thing that stays the same, and maybe we should be open to that notion a little bit. That's why people have housing collectives where it's not the case that anybody can just drop in and sleep there or whatever, although often they can. But I was going to say something totally different. Oh, damn. About colonizing the internet. I thought that the point, does that arise in the Wikipedia article too? That language? I feel like I saw it in two places. Once in, or maybe it was on two separate readings of the same article. I don't remember. I thought that the reference to Marx there was meant to say it's easy to take the way things are for granted or to imagine it as inevitable. That is the mistake that Peel made when he moved to Australia. He thought that this was that capitalism was a natural state of affairs. In fact, capitalism, as Marx understood it, is an integrated system. And you need the whole ideological framework, the whole superstructure in order to support the base, right? And that doesn't just mean religion, but it also means ideas about how we make contracts and how we make agreements with each other and just how we comport ourselves socially. So the analogy, as I understood it, was about the nature of the internet. And I think that there was a kind of, there is a kind of problematic way in which the internet is pictured as an empty space that's going to be colonized somehow or something like that. But it's useful to say, the way that things work right now is not like a technological necessity. It's a social technical system. And the different parts happen to fit together the way they do in our society. But with imagination, we can see how different social structures can be, and different economic structures might be compatible with the same technical infrastructure or similar technical infrastructure. That was how I understood that point. And to me, it was kind of compelling, as a way for us to think about what is the nature of the effect one would like to have. Like, we're building technical tools, we're also building social structures, or we also must build social structures along with them if we want a different kind of world. So we got to pay attention to both sides. That's kind of how I understood that passage.
Okay, so I can jump in. I was gonna speak to that and then try and do a weird threading back to possession, because I feel like I'm really tripping over it, and maybe y'all can help. But yeah, I kind of, similar to you, Matt, read the framing of colonization. Like, it's maybe a little fraught, but also then if you look at early language of like cyber libertarianism, they like talked about the internet as a frontier and sort of like recreated. To me, it feels like a similar idiom around like engaging in that space, which is like pretty intense. And then I actually did find that article, I'm not going to attempt the name again, really powerful for like kind of not only what you just said, but also thinking about like almost like making a case for ownership in a way that, or like it kind of brought together, like I think what I'm stuck on is like, when is ownership of possession the same and when are they not? And this maybe connects a little bit to what Rob was like Rob mentioned, like liking the Goodreads article. And in that one, I thought through like, I guess empirical work that was like an attempt to kind of grapple with that, because people, like it sort of revealed this like disjunct in their perceptions of like, maybe what, like when their possession changed, or like how they thought they had some degree of control and equated that with a form of ownership, and then found out it didn't when like the real owners changed. But then I was thinking about like, say in decentralized protocols, or say even like say with Git, like we all possess a copy of whatever Git repo that we've cloned, but like, is that the same as actually owning the repo? And like when those are disaggregated, and actually I think that is a cleavage that happens with a lot of decentralized stuff. I mean, like Patrick and SSB and having a distributed blog store is similar. And in the digital space, I think there's a separation there, which is like, that to me seems like maybe a big difference is that possession has become this slightly different thing, and like low cost replication, but then also identity of it still being the same. Like they just do a lot. So that's where I'm tangled. But I thought these readings were helpful for that.
Mash, I think, is up, unless there's somebody who wants to respond immediately to Don.
I guess since we kind of brought up like the whole issue of like capitalism, and I guess almost like the Goodreads article just made me think of how the struggle between like the platform owners and then how the users responded to it in like a way that like we contribute to this, and trying to have like power play of I'll withdraw my contributions or my participation if you don't make the platform in a way that works for me. And so I thought it was almost like a kind of a unionization issue where it failed because it was just these individual members just commenting angrily. But I don't know I don't know enough about like the history of the internet to really speak in too much detail about this, but like there's been other phenomena of this, of users of platforms trying to like coalesce and be like, hey, we don't like what you're doing, we want to like do a thing together. But as far as I know, a lot of them have failed in the past. Like there's been massive, like, well, not massive, but visible revolts like on Facebook of like people trying to say like fuck Zuckerberg, blah, 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 like, but none of them actually led to any change in the same way that neither did the Goodreads merger or acquisition lead to any change based on the reactions of the users. So it's kind of interesting because it's like going back to like social contract theory and like how the users are like, well, the platforms exist because we're here and we want to use them, so they should change in order to suit our needs. But because there's no like real organization and unionization in that sense, all of their calls to change are generally ineffective.
I see Sung Young, and then Rob.
Hey, so I really like the counter anti-disintermediation article where it talks about the concept of I think it was systematic colonization, where he uses the metaphor of the systematic colonization scheme, which was essentially an artificial inflation of land prices for new colonizers, colonizing capitalists, so that they would treat the land differently, or rather, there would be a higher bar to entry into the colony for capitalists, and the spread into the wilderness by the colonizing capitalists would be slowed down, and so there would be more focus on the existing lands and the development of the existing lands. And the entirety of that systematic colonization scheme was focused on the notion that that people who pay for the land will be the ones who develop it into a usable state, and that the work going into the development of the land bought by these capitalists would be what makes the colonies into a more habitable place. And applied to the internet, this analogy seems to suggest that that ownership is intricately linked with the development of the context, whether it be the enclosure or otherwise. And I'm wondering whether the inverse is true. For example, in terms of the 19th article that we were looking at, where having possession is interchangeable almost with having ownership in terms of how people treat the enclosure. And this also came up earlier, where it could either end up an enclosure or a sanctuary.
Well, that's really interesting. I'm just listening to that over again in my head. The difference between an enclosure and a sanctuary. Let's not drop that. But Rob, you were going to go.
I think that's super interesting. I think the one thing I just want to say in response to Mash's point was there was also another sort of like associated item in one of the readings from the book. I can't remember which one. There's talking about how he was in some meeting with a bunch of like Uber drivers, and it started out with a lot of complaining, and then all of a sudden it turned into like collective brainstorming about action, but then devolved back into complaining. Yes, the Mechanical Turks part. And I thought that was interesting. Later on, from one of the other readings, I got to thinking, because there was a lot of, I think I wrote it out here in the notes, there's a lot around like this idea of sort of, well, in general, in all of these about like possession and everything, and especially, I think it was in the same one that was about colonization of space, and the thought I got to thinking about was, because I also had trouble at the beginning of that whole colonization thing with like really matching that up to the internet. And once I came back around at the end and re-explained it in a way that matched up for me, which sort of said, but then like once we got more people and bigger scale things, we realized that like the infrastructure is expensive and hard to maintain and requires expertise. And so like that created a situation where people sort of like had to cede that control or like somehow felt forced to cede that land. And so the thought for me in there was like, if possession is taken back, like whether it's with like super distributed tools or whatever, what does that mean for like the requirements on individuals who possess and own things to understand how they work in the technical space? And how do we make that feasible if those requirements are high? Yeah, that's just long, winding set of thoughts.
Go ahead, Tom.
This is sort of like a direct response to you, Rob, or like a build on that. I thought there was a really interesting move, and I'm also going to forget, I know it was one of the platform cooperativism chapters, but I think it might have been the counter one, where I thought there was this like actually interesting move, or it almost was like not collective. It was like atomizing people into individuals. And so kind of to what you just said about like what becomes individual responsibility, like I actually would love to talk a little bit about that, if like whatever that strategy of like changing the structures that we have now is like that, the model of where it goes, one where like people are acting as individuals or acting collectively. I don't know, like it felt like there was a few different views being put forward across the 3 chapters we read. I think the counter one, I'm just going to search, is the one that had the like more individual take.
Okay, so I was just writing in this long thing in the thing, but I'll say it instead. So Michelle was just in Winnipeg visiting her parents, and her dad is dying, and they're kind of going around looking at old family stuff, and her family's lived in Winnipeg since time immemorial. And on one side, they're Métis, which is this interesting mixed Indigenous thing that we have in Canada. And there was a revolution in Manitoba at the end of the 19th century, which was put down. And when people came back, they were allotted land, but then of the like 93 allotments that were given out, 86 were taken back for failure to cultivate. So what did this make me think of? Why did Rob's thing make me think of this? That when we have resources which are potentially collective, then we need to, somehow there are conflicting possible authorities over those resources. And in territory, like in land, we have a state that arbitrates conflicts over land. And that state turns out, historically to, be fundamentally a corrupt force, basically in every case that you look at, favoring one class of users over another class. And you can see it it's like in the Magna Carta too, it doesn't have to be a colonial enterprise. So we're in a situation like a technological development where it's hard to imagine that people are going to run big servers in their houses. I suppose that could happen, but it seems unlikely. We have these resources which are right now owned by corporations, but there could be some realignment of the ownership characteristics of these giant resources, and they could become more like utilities, Like they could become nationalized. Various kinds of things could happen. There are going to be different kinds of actors trying to claim rights to those resources. What are the types of conflicts we could expect? What are the kinds of resolutions that we might hope for in terms of seeing the kind of world that we'd like to live in? It does seem like we ought to be asking ourselves those kinds of questions, either individually or as a society, Totally uninformed off the top of my head. I'd like to try to specify a little better. I don't know how much of the conversation I've missed, sorry. The relationship between possession and ownership. It seems to me, Don, when you brought this up earlier, you were at least in part referring to kind of something that Benjamin notes in the work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which is that, things are different now. They no longer are unitary in their physical existence. We can now reproduce things. And that was sort of true in the 1920s, and it's more true in the 21st century, where the things that matter, some of the things that matter the most are just sequences and patterns of bits, and those can be reproduced multiply. So one can't exactly possess those kinds of things, or one can possess those things easily without owning them, and then, like I do all the time. Every time you download something from BitTorrent, but also every time you watch something on Netflix, you also, it runs through your browser, and that sequence of bits, is, as it were, physically in my laptop right here, but I don't own it. What I'm kind of more interested in, maybe than that, though, is, are there cases where you can own something without possessing it at all? Instead of possessing something without owning it, what does it mean to own something without possessing it? And I think there's something strange going on in Goodreads, and like where we have to be kind of careful of our language a little bit, but like Goodreads users feel a sense of what one might call a sense of ownership about Goodreads. That's part of why they get pissed off. They feel like this is their thing that's being taken from them by a corporate overlord. So I wonder if maybe the distinction that I'm actually most interested in is the difference between legal ownership and the sense of ownership, or the sense of belonging, which is maybe interestingly different. Ran out of thoughts, so I'll just let you guys continue.
Can I jump in?
Please.
So I linked something in the HackPad about maritime law, which is where a lot of the 9/10 originally the discussion links out to if you actually search it in legal context. And there's these interesting terms of art about flotsam, jetsam, lagan, and derelict, and they're about the different states of existence that an object can have on the basis of contingent claims that one might be making about how you left it there. And I find it really interesting because in a lot of cases on social networks and even on GitHub, places like that, you have different states of abandonment and tenuous continued claim to some level of mutually exclusive determination of what the future may hold for something, where an author of an old work may not want to release its source, but they may not want to say that it's abandoned, or they may want to they may not want to allow it to be continued to be under development by someone they don't like, or who they've had major disagreements about the direction of something with, and so they will allow someone to continue to allow it to exist and persist and thrive under some new steering, but not any given person. And the units of analysis thing seems tricky because it seems that in some cases there are parts and wholes, and you really are focusing on the objects, the material contents that you are thinking about, and that could be something like the possession of a secret key, or the possession of a video that someone has made, or the possession of an account, for instance. But in some cases, that falls apart. It crumbles because the nature of what is at stake is fundamentally not about parts and wholes. It's about a process and interactions between actors. And I think Patchwork is really interesting because it sidesteps all the talk about blockchain and all the object-orientedness about blockchain completely, and people cut to the chase entirely about the social aspects of trying to have communities that are not plugged into a centralized platform. And the end result is that you see a lot of people who are new to Patchwork asking the same questions, and they have the same reservations every single time. Oh, I have to replicate like that asshole's like Nazi content. Oh, maybe I don't want to do that. Maybe I don't want an open community. Maybe I want the ability to oh, I can't delete the blobs. Oh, well, actually I can delete them, but I don't know which ones they are. So I would have I don't have the technical means to figure out which ones they are yet. Okay, well, someone's working on it. They're going to write a thing that will help me figure out which one is the Nazi assholes content. And you see this time and time again when people realize that they are holding someone else's bags, that the material actually matters, and it matters in a concrete way in terms of knowing that you don't have to, I guess, adversely possess things to which you want to disclaim any sort of involvement. If that makes any sense, knowing that you want to divorce yourself from some aspect of some technical implementation or some subset of some broader patchwork of communities, it is important that you can show that you do not actually have a material stake in propping that up. And that seems sort of obvious, but I don't think that that's obvious to people whose only term of art is just the word decentralized, because they see everything as being there are these kill points. There's these pressure points, and that if you funnel through the super nodes, and if you remove the super nodes, then you solve all the problems. But even if you have a decentralized system, you still have more important and less important nodes in the system because you have higher volume ones that have greater connectivity to the rest of the nodes. And so you still end up having, people have to make choices that reflect what they want the local, what they want their section of the graph to look like. And that seems to be difficult because almost no one can reason about this, can reason about what a graph looks like and what through being 3 hops out from someone looks like, and whether that means that you are replicating a follower of a follower's Nazi post or not. No one can really keep up with that. Like you have Dunbar's number, you have these different limitations on just the ability to keep track of different people. And so platforms, for all their failings, they do, in an administrative sense, they make it less, they make it impersonal. They make that decision making impersonal, and that has a value proposition that a lot of people who only they just basically use the word decentralized as their excuse to justify anything that they're building. I don't think that they appreciate that the administrative bureaucracy of something being divorced from whether it's a guy that you don't like making the decision is important, because they will impersonally screw you over. They will not screw you over because that guy doesn't like you and because he wants to block you out of your friend group, and you had a falling out with that guy, and so that means you can never talk on his chat network again. That they have an impersonal, completely inhumane and sanitized view of what goes, and it's this totalizing view. I don't know. I'm kind of it's falling apart here, but it seems that the fact that Zuckerberg is the one tasked with, and the fact that that Jack of Twitter, they are tasked with having invariant rules that clearly will never work for all populations around the world for filtering the content of their network. That means that you don't have to do that. And that is not obvious if you don't think about the fact that if you disintermediate, you disaggregate the performing of administrative tasks. And so if you don't have some sort of golden rule that if you tied something to a buoy, that means that you own it and you walk away. if you don't have a system that has some sort of, I don't know, massive bureaucratic reach, even if you're in the deep reaches of the ocean, then people will just come along and say, oh, that thing, I'm just going to take it because that was left there. I can take that. If you don't have the overlord of the feudal state insisting that you don't interfere with other people's stuff, because that would cause whoever is their paying customer, maybe the advertisers on the network, to not to divest from their network. You have to now watch your stuff. You have to get a bike lock, and you have to ensure that people are not trying to mess with your stuff. And that's a huge amount of human labor and time and effort and stress and all that goes completely under the radar most of the time in discussions about distributing and decentralizing things. Yeah.
Go ahead, Dawn, and if the non-talkers want to start talking soon, that'd be great.
Yeah, there's like a lot in there that I want to kind of hold on to it in future discussions. And so I just kind of had 2 small points, but not to try and like bring closure to that, because I feel like that actually was a great way to open up a lot of questions. I think this notion of sort of like administrative functions or something, I mean, I'm really excited as that is sort of a setup to think about commons, right? Because that is trying to think about self-governing and the rules and creating the rules together, and then figuring out the process by which you change those rules to govern together and sort of like make those sorts of like, I guess, surface and make visible that kind of administrative work in a sense. And I'm kind of excited maybe in that talk to also draw on a couple examples of how people are trying to think about it in the context of community networks or mesh, or if there's some distributed sensor network stuff too, I think, projects. So not to say that it's necessarily working, but maybe that like could reveal that thing. And then the other small bit is actually, I feel like also have maybe done a segue, and it'd be cool if people wanted to sort of turn a little bit concretely to the platform cooperativism principles, because I think in those 7 principles, like I think almost that's what those principles function as the way to create a framework of cooperation amongst distinct entities if they agree to them. And I think that's also set up for commons, because like what does it mean for discrete groups of people to say we're all going to agree to be bound by these principles and work on them, but one of them is like cooperation amongst each other and like, you know, concern for community and autonomy and independence. So there's something about using those principles as framing, which I think might also get at this notion of like where the administration lies when you disintermediate or decentralize or distribute, and how maybe that kind of is left out when people are just like decentralization.
Rob was, I think, the next, yeah.
Okay. I hope I don't get in the way of that shifting conversation, but I really, really wanted to react to what Jeremy was saying, and that it made me think a lot about the book Mushroom at the End of the World, which if folks here haven't read it, you should totally read it. And I think it fits in really, really well with what we were just talking about. And it's basically, it examines sort of the patchwork of like approaches and communities, but also the capitalization and transfer and packaging up of value and things between them through looking at the trade of matsutake mushrooms around the world. It's a really interesting book, but it has a lot about these ideas of like, you have different small jurisdictions, you have overlapping ideas of commons and how those fit together, and how things can be like sort of transformed through trade. So that idea of how things get from like different small patchwork groups operating in different ways, and they get sort of like transformed in the ways in which like different groups move things from place to place and transform them in that moving. So like things go from like the crazy, like communal, like auctiony, messy way that people like pick mushrooms in like Oregon, to like packaging up through like middlemen in trade into like a hyper organized Japanese market that has none of the same sense of like the individuals on the other end, but the like issues with the individuals and the certain cares and this person's okay and that's not, mostly sort of get worked out in that space and in that transformation. Although it's also very imperfect in a lot of ways. Anyway, there's a lot there. And that there's also, I feel like something there in that, like the point about like blockchain, and I think a lot of like, maybe this gets a little crazy, but that always jumps out at me is this question of like, I always think about people who are super excited about blockchain and especially about Bitcoin blockchain, in this, back to this way of talking about decentralization, being so focused on like the technical side of it and like the technical solution where you stop thinking about the social organization issues. You're just like, screw all that. I'm going to look at like the hard brass tacks, like I take your thing. How do I solve that side of it? And like Bitcoin attempts to like look at trust that way, but what it really does is it sort of like transforms social trust into like trust in like an idea about how much power an individual can have in a similar way to the way like capitalism transforms like trade and care about goods and individuals into like, I can have this abstract concept of dollars and do that. I don't know, that's a like very abstract idea, but I feel like it fits in there a little, and I forget what I really wanted to say with all of this, but read Mushroom at the End of the World.
I'm feeling a little lost. Dawn wanted to talk about the principles for platform collectivism, right? Where is that?
I just thought that might be a way to go back to those two readings, but Rob, I think you had an interjection.
Yes, so that reminded me about something more on track with what you're saying, which is like something you were saying earlier about that made me think back to what I was thinking about earlier about what does like this idea of repossession mean about what individuals need to know or be capable of technically, and also your point about sort of the atomization, like this, that in that whichever piece in the book it was, like it very much looks at like two very far ends of the spectrum of like this atomized view of individuals and everything must be totally distributed in order to work, and the other extreme end of this like corporate aggregation of everything. And how do different types of like, it doesn't really speak very well to like how do different types of co-ops or collectives fit in the middle, and how can we like where are the right solutions in there for distributing like the individuals who have that technical expertise to like maintain that for small co-ops that are interconnected in some way, then like maybe that's the right solution to that sort of set of things, if I'm going in the right direction for what you were thinking, Dawn. That's all I got.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm finding myself at the end of my focus period, so I apologize to everyone for that. I feel like a little bit like we're like a little scattered, having heard a million really interesting things and struggling to bring it back to some form of coherence. If Dawn, I don't know if you want to talk about the Schultz piece, I guess, how platform cooperation or the 7 cooperative principles, the Susan Cagle piece. What did you want to do?
I mean, and I think I appreciate Jeremy dropped some examples in. Like, I think if we wanted to just talk a little bit about what platform cooperatives look like, that actually might be nice. I mean, my sense coming out of today feels similar in the, but maybe in a good way. Like, I think this was a topic we didn't feel like we knew a lot about, and it kind of almost felt like there wasn't, like, I feel like we started today and we were like, oh, the ground is undisturbed, there's not a lot there, and now we're like, oh my gosh, so many things are growing in this garden that we didn't know were here. That maybe it would be cool to sort of identify the most promising ones. Like, maybe that's the step, right, is to say, coming out of this discussion, these seem really promising. Like, now all I want to read about is maritime law. Don't know about all you. So I can pull up, what I was really thinking of was actually just this graphic, which was on page, it was at the end of, I think, Trevor Schultz's piece. So it was on page 27 and 28 of the book. And it was like the 7 cooperative principles. So I'm sorry, those actually aren't the platform cooperativism principles. They're just of cooperatives more generally. And I can just say them. And then maybe if we want to talk a bit about like platform cooperativism examples, and if people want to share any ones they have, that could be cool. So the ones that are provided in these come from, I'm going to say it wrong, is it the Rochdale Principles from 1844? And then also adopted by a cooperative alliance, the International Cooperative Alliance in 1995. So the first one is anti-discriminatory open membership, and I think we touched on what open and why maybe you want closed membership might look like. So I think there's something kind of like nuanced in there. Democratic member control, equitable member economic participation, I feel like these are mouthfuls, autonomy and independence, education, training, and information, cooperation among cooperatives, and then concern for community. And then I think if anyone actually has them ready to hand, I was actually a little unclear about what the platform cooperativism principles were. I think he kind of identified the saying like there's 4 strategies, and then they kind of got lost and said, here are some principles, but then he like only explicitly calls out 2 as principles. So the one that I'm aware of him saying is communal ownership of platforms and protocols, and the other one is they have to be able to offer income security and good pay. I know, Jeremy, you dropped some examples in the notepad. Do you want to add anything, or does anyone else have an idea, or like I want to talk a little bit about a co-op or a platform co-op now?
So I Sung Masha and I do know the sole original employee of Platform Co-op Consortium. So we're sort of hiding our power level here a bit because we don't want to tinge the discussion too much along just it's social interpersonal lines about knowing people. So the examples that they often trot out as and that they've discussed at length as examples of things that are pretty substantial or non-trivial. I mean, when you think of co-ops, I think it's fair to say that you think of bagels at college campuses. You think of either industry consortia, which are formed as a legal strategy to limit liability as co-ops, and those are things where they might be cabals, and they do something like data sharing, and they basically it's the co-op is their multi-party equivalent of an LLC, where they just have to pay dues. They need a co-op to make sure that it happens, or they are very, very small time, very localized things that can easily be crowded out by a new chain, a new Pete's coffee shop, and they're often run by locals, and they're info shops in cities that have bookstores and that sort of culture. They're hostels. They're various types of local service sector things and local point of sale things. And so the examples that they give are this Midata, MIDATA, and Resonate. Resonate is like they call it stream to own, and that goes back to what Matt was saying earlier about the notion of owning something by possessing it, or rather is possessing it interchange. I forget. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you were talking about the trickiness of digital artifacts and ownership of them and replication specifically. And I think Resonate is a pretty decent example. And in general, streaming music alternatives are a pretty good example of the pressure points that exist in terms of the good feel vibes that people get from participating in something that is alternative versus the realities that you must provide incentives that delineate between the audience and the makers of the content and so forth. Because if you check out something like Resonate, ultimately its current state, I think it's fair to say that it's a prototype for a streaming platform, and it's basically a WordPress site. And if you click on any of the links without being signed in, then they may not work at the moment. And there's these notions that I think people who are already active in the notion of I want to pay for content, and I want to own content, and I support artists. They mistake for something that people will do if they have it, even if they have any other alternative. And the example that I think is really useful is Spotify, because Spotify is parasitic, but it plays on the base needs of the audience to the expense of the the creators of the content with respect to the fact that most people want to have a music library that exceeds what they would otherwise store locally. And so anything that claims that the only limit is your hard drive, well, that's already a limit beyond what Spotify affords users. That's already beyond, because many people have comically large Spotify libraries. They don't want to pay. They would rather put up with very grating ads every few minutes or so, or to avoid paying. And they're not calculating. They're not pulling out a calculator to see, okay, if my 3,000th of a cent toward the artist, if I play this 5 million times, they might get $1. That's they are being presented with essentially DRM and told, you can listen to this. You can't download it, but you can listen to it indefinitely. And that puts the creators of the content in a position where if they want people to buy the content, they need to give them something more. They need to give them a premium package. They need to put the album on Bandcamp and say, you get the album art, you get the extras, and like, give me $2. Give me $2 for it. You get the high resolution, high def files, and then you own it. You don't stream it, and you download it and you have it. Resonate has this idea of streaming to own, and that if you listen more, eventually you own it. With the idea being that if you listen to stuff enough that you would want to own it, then that is aligning your incentives with those of the people making the stuff. And I think that might be a good idea, but in practice, it may simply cost more to do than is actually feasible. Because you have to be able to essentially look and feel and act like Spotify without the infrastructure of Spotify, without the partnerships of Spotify, without the library, the huge depth of all the content that they have. And you need to have people able to track, oh, I'm making a point of listening here so that if I listen enough times, then eventually I will have the file. Like, well, they can just go to YouTube and download the video, or they can go anywhere and get the content. And this is in contrast to something like Me Data, which is like a healthcare data portability co-op, and that is more polished and I think more likely to be the sort of thing that would play out well, because there's all this pre-existing regulatory capture of healthcare data, and there's all this concern about this. There's already all these regulations that would incentivize big players to basically consider healthcare data toxic assets that they don't necessarily want to try to sell. And so a lot of times it seems like the co-op model comes down to, does it work for the thing that you're trying to do? Do you have the right parties involved, and do you have runway to try to exist in a competitive space where people who are not constrained by being a co-op can just as easily do all the things that you're doing without incurring any of the costs, without networking with other people who are also nonprofit. And I'm sort of rambling on here, but those two are, I think, useful. Two pretty broadly different types of co-ops that come up.
Yeah. What did that make me think there? That very final point, about the viability of cooperatives in a, a well-established system that is predicated on certain economic principles, basically derived from Mandeville, which are, that private vice makes public virtue, right? That greed is a force for collective welfare, right? I mean, so I don't know. Do you guys know Bernard Mandeville and the Fable of the Bees? Everybody know that? No. early 17th century physician, Dutch physician living in England, who wrote a book that was very influential for Adam Smith, in which he says, if you look at a beehive, it's interesting because his vision of the beehive is very different from ours. Then you see that the bees are all acting independently, and they're all greedy for honey, and they're trying to crowd each other out and get close to the king of the bees, the king of the hive, who lives in the center, who we now call the queen, because she's female. But through their individual greed, they create something amazing. And capitalism is like that, is the argument. And then that, you have people who they have no intention of doing anything good, and yet they make something good by accident. And that good is the welfare of the people as a whole. And Smith says something similar about how markets work, and then Hayek later kind of translates it into this efficiency argument about the efficiency of information transfer in the early part of the 20th century. And we've, at least in public discourse for the most part, accept that notion that we run our society largely predicated on the idea that people should look out for themselves, and in so doing, they will kind of innovate and find efficiencies that will ultimately make the world better for everyone. There are some limits on this, and that's why we have laws. But basically, we want, we're going to run our society like that. I think an interesting question is, how do you try to operate on some other principle in a world that is largely organized, around a consensus view that greed is the thing that makes a society work? I have this kind of interesting, I don't know. I've been thinking about it a lot because I've been thinking about solidarity in our organization in EDGI. That Union Team Solidarity Forever, we don't really talk about solidarity that much. It's not a civic virtue that we care about, at least not explicitly, but in the early part of the 20th century, it was at the heart of what a good society means. So I think these co-ops and other non-competitive forms of economic organization struggle to express some alternative to the kind of default capitalist mode. I hate that. As I said earlier, I hate to say capitalism. I don't feel like it means that much. So I hate it when I find myself saying it. Anyway, who wants to go next in the last 1 minute? Dawn, do you want to sum up? Is there an emoji for throwing someone under the bus?
I think you should use it to describe me. So this is just a returning favor emoji. No, that was great. And it's funny because for other reasons I've been thinking about solidarity, and I've been slipping the word into everything I've done. I think I used it at the beginning of the Our Networks conference. I said transnational solidarities. I was pretty proud of that one. So anyway, I think what I dropped in the comments is a way to maybe not wrap this up, give us a sense of being able to move on today, but knowing the conversation continues would be, and we're kind of at time, if people are okay giving us a couple extra minutes, maybe no more than 5. If there was any key thing that kind of excited us, I felt like we had these points where everyone got wanted to sort of circle around, so identifying those in particular with a view to should we integrate that into one of our upcoming sessions. And I'm just gonna slowly try to switch tabs and browsers here, because why not? to say all of the remaining topics we have. Okay, so next time we're actually reading about commons, which I feel like was really nicely set up by a lot of today, and I think commons in relation to co-ops is like, there's something in there that I think was cool, so I'm excited to get to talk about that with y'all next. And then we have some set of readings for that, but I think could easily fit one more in if people think there's a theme from today that fits. The one following is centralization versus decentralization and peer-to-peer federation. And actually, I think that would be the slot to maybe find a reading from today that we want to revisit on, because I feel like today was like a good way to sort of, it was like a rallying cry against collapsing decentralization into a monolith. And actually, there's all these common rights, and Richard Mabey wrote this book about the history of the commons, and like those have epic names too, like Estoverse. So like maybe we could like find our common rights, we could like come back to maritime law, we could talk decentralization. And then the one after that is privacy, where we have very few readings and mostly scant ideas and hopes. And then the final topic was going to be justice. Yeah, so maybe from today, is there one specific area that seemed like was the most active, and or an area we want to work to identify one or two readings from, or a couple areas? And I think aiming to fit them in, maybe not next month, but possibly, and then otherwise over the sort of coming 3 months.
That was a question, right? it's very
sometimes I don't.
I'm sort of baked. I for one would like to. So our focus, the three of us who are lurker faces here, throughout this whole period, is on making web archival tools that really low skill users can use, that are basically work exactly the same way for skilled users. And so I would like to talk about something that ends up being moving toward the idea of owning history, of de-biasing history away from the direction of what is visible for for skilled users to save, and what researchers would want to collect from a social network or from the web, versus what existed, and the idea of cloning a substrate of material versus mining it, and who can, and things like we're working on things like trying to do memento meta aggregation and shit like that. So that would involve stuff like private web archival, and so in terms of privacy, toward the end, that might be more relevant, or maybe during the commons, where you might feasibly surface some of the material of web archives, but not all the sensitive material, etc.
Just to pull from what Matt dropped in chat, I mean, I think you're right that we could see splitting that twice, right? So this notion of enclosure, I think, really feels good to address during the commons discussion, but also I really love that sort of putting sanctuary beside enclosure, and what that means for maybe not always wanting everything open. So that could come up on the privacy one, and maybe the site around web archiving is being sort of like particularly productive. Any other, it's okay if people don't have any immediate thoughts, you can drop them in the Slack channel afterwards, or drop them on this hackpad if they come to you, and or GitHub. We just have a lot of different areas where you can put things. And also one thing to just prompt people, I've sort of enrolled Matt as the facilitator this time, but I think our goal was to swap. So I'm more than happy to take on being a facilitator for one session, but if there's an area people have particular interest in, if you would like to facilitate, that would be great too. And the best way to do that maybe would just be to say so in the chat now before we end today, or the Slack, or I'm not going to say all the channels again, but just indicate somewhere. And I'll make sure to be a little better. My schedule is less travel hectic before the next one, to send a longer reminder and potentially also a call out for a facilitator for the common session.
Would you like, I can make a hashtag on Patchwork, data together reading, would that work?
Yeah, feel free. I'll chime in there. I can drop links. That'd be great.
They generally don't. So I would like to find out more about. So they like to do discussion openly, but it's somewhat technically difficult sometimes for people who are not following the pubs that are the ones that will get you the right followers to actually see the full contents of conversations. So like conventionally, if you wanted to get some readings on Patchwork, you might just shoot someone an email, but that's not really how they like to do things. They like to do things, on Patchwork. So that might be an easier way to elicit something from people who are more involved in that network than I am, or any of us, as far as I know.
Yeah, I think using a hashtag in that way, and sort of also trying to say if there's any readings that Patchwork folks enjoy or want to offer, that would be great. I mean, I know what they tend to do is link to like the hash of a post, and then sometimes I have a hard time keeping them straight, but it's cool. We can do that.
Yeah, in the gateway that you use as well. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And
it's a delight. I actually really enjoy it.
It's really cool, and I think that it's one of the most productive things in this direction of focus, completely backseating all the tech focus and focusing on what doesn't the tech do, even if you have all the tech in the world. What does that not solve for you? Because that is more or less the problem that most people are interested in, and they get totally bamboozled by discussion of the stack, and the stack often doesn't matter. Social stuff matters, and so they're really good at that. So
okay, that sounds great, and it sounds like we think we might aim for adding in some readings that came out of today over the next 2 months. And then the last that I was going to say is actually a bunch of us, or some number of us, are going to be at the Decentralized Web Summit next week. And maybe it's more of us than I know on this call. But I think there could be maybe a way to try and see other people who are interested in thinking and talking and understanding some of this stuff and what other resources currently exist. I mean, I think we kind of have a good structure to carry us through this cycle of a reading group, but maybe there will be inspiration there. So
do you
that's all I
know? Do they have a resource? Do they have any sort of resource base? We are poor. We don't have. We're not going to the Decentralized Web Summit. So are they aggregate? Are they doing something that will be public, or do you know off the top? I remember 2016. It was very difficult if you didn't know to join the Slack or to join the Matrix Bridge, you didn't find out about certain things. And that kind of irked me.
So maybe just because I think people need to leave, I'm happy to stay on and we can
sorry.
I'll stay on this call and let's have that chat, and I'll give you all I know, but I gotta be honest, I'm sure imperfect, and I don't feel very aware of everything. So I'm maybe suffering from what you are. So why don't we say thank you all for coming. This was great. Thank you, Matt, for letting me make you facilitate. And see everyone next time in August. And then I'll stay on this call if we want to talk about Decentralized Web Summit.
Great. Bye, guys.
Oh, and I'll stop recording now.